Hello and welcome to the FatBoss guide to Kil'Jaeden in the Tomb of Sargeras.
So this final boss has 3 phases and 2 intermission phases. The key to defeating this boss is having a strong understanding of the mechanics and preparing for them before they're even cast. And like many end bosses, there are many rough overlaps throughout the phases that will wipe you very quickly if you don't deal with them properly. So let's kick it off and let's talk about phase 1.
So during phase 1 you want to position the boss in the middle of the room and face him away from the raid at all times because of fell claws. Whilst this 12-second buff is active, the boss's melee attacks cleave in a cone, applying a stacking debuff that increases the physical damage you take by 35%. Now the best way to deal with fell claws is to have a single tank keep the boss for the entire duration, using cooldowns to cover the entire 12 seconds that it's active. Immediately when it drops, you want to have the other tank taunt. You'll need to take turns for each time fell claws is up. For all other players, just do not move in front of the boss. Now the most important ability for you to deal with is Armageddon. When cast, this spawns multiple small meteors around the encounter room and one large meteor. As soon as they spawn, you have 7 seconds to react and go and soak them. If a single meteor lands, it can easily wipe you as it deals a large amount of damage and applies a super nasty dot. Now the little one should be soaked by a single player, whilst the large one should be soaked by whatever tank currently does not have any Fellclaw stacks, as the meteor does a large amount of physical damage and you'll need to use cooldowns for this. However, in larger raid sizes, it's definitely worth using other players' immunities instead. This includes things like Blessing of Protection. Using immunities makes it far easier on the tanks, allowing them to use more cooldowns for the Fellclaws. Once you soaked an Armageddon, you'll gain a lengthy dot. This dot with a single stack is fine, however more than one stack and it gets pretty rough. So only ever soak twice in a row if you have to. It is better that you get a second stat than the raid wiping to an unsoaked meteor. Also to deal with is the Rupturing Singularity. On a timer, the boss will spawn an orb in the middle of the room that will slowly drop to the platform. Once it lands, it will knock back everybody in the raid. As soon as it spawns, you want to stand close to it and position yourself so you're knocked into the corners of the room. On Heroic, the knockback is a little stronger, and if you're stood with your back to a side, you can be knocked off the platform and instantly killed. Now when moving close to the orb ready for the knockback, make sure you're not within the landing location, as that will also instantly kill you. After the first Rupturing Singularity, the rest will now spawn randomly on any of the 4 corners of the room. This actually makes it pretty easy to deal with, as you can counter all of them by just standing in the middle of the room, because the knockback won't knock you off the platform. Now on Heroic, the ability in this phase to deal with is the Shadow Reflection ads. 3 players within the raid will receive a debuff that will spawn one of these ads when the debuff expires 8 seconds later. These ads spam cast Erupting Dreadflame that deals damage to the entire raid. However, each cast buffs the other ads, increasing the damage if they're within 20 yards of each other. So there are 2 ways of dealing with these ads. One, you can just stack them up. If your damage is high enough, this is definitely the best option. We just use healing cooldowns for the second cast to cover the damage. However, if you're reaching the third cast, it'll pretty much one-shot your raid, so your damage does need to be high enough to kill them before that point. The second way to deal with it is if you don't have the damage requirement, then just simply separate them by 20 yards. This isn't particularly ideal as they will die a lot slower. However, it does remove any damage requirement on them as they won't be buffing each other anymore. Once you get the hang of all that, the boss will transition at 80% health.
At this point, the boss will leave the platform and begin to fly around to different locations outside the encounter room. During this time, he's typically out of range, but he's also taking 99% less damage, therefore it's pointless attacking him. All you need to do in this intermission is simply stay alive. In this phase, he'll still be doing Armageddon, and on Heroic, he'll also be doing Rupturing Singularity. You deal with these the exact same way. You do, however, have to deal with 2 new abilities. Bursting Dreadflames are applied to multiple people all at the exact same time. This ability causes you to explode and deal damage to anyone within your targeting circle after around 4 seconds. This sadly, however, is not a debuff, therefore it's pretty difficult to determine if you actually have it or not, especially if your raid is stacked up. When it is applied to you, it does however state in your combat log, therefore boss mods such as Bigwigs and Deadly Boss mods will let you know if you have it with either a text alert or a flash. All players affected should move to the edges of the encounter area, just away from the rest of the raid. Now this ability does overlap with Armageddon once during this transition. It's ideal that the affected players do not soak meteors during this time, and just keep away from any other players that are attempting to soak the Armageddon. But if you do have to soak them, then soak them. As Alex said, it's not worth letting one go off just because you have a debuff. And also to deal with is the Focus Dreadflame. This is a long cast that will fire a beam from the boss to a marked player, dealing an absolutely insane amount of damage. This damage is however split between all players within the beam. The moment the target is picked, you want to have your raid stack within the beam to help that player live. And do note that the beam can also be soaked behind the player as well as in front. On Heroic, however, players within the beam will also pulse damage within 5 yards of themselves once the beam hits. This makes stacking within the beam a really bad idea. We assign roughly a third of our raid to assist with the beam every single time it's cast. This reduces the chance that players are ever hit by the extra pulse damage. Now this beam will come in almost the exact same time that an Armageddon does. We deal with it the exact same way, it just means that there are less people available to go and soak the Armageddons, so non-beam players must react quickly. And after you've dealt with all of that, the boss will return to the platform and phase 2 will begin.
Now phase 2 is just a mixture of the first phase and the intermission. You have the Fell Claws, Armageddon, Rupturing Singularity, Bursting and Focused Dread Flames, and the Shadow Reflection adds to deal with, so there's a lot going on. And on top of this, all of these abilities will be overlapping at multiple points, making this arguably the hardest phase. We use Bloodlust the moment the phase starts, just to burn him into the second intermission as soon as possible. Our best advice for this phase is just to simply keep an eye on your timers. Reacting to the abilities before they're even cast is the key. Now reflection adds from this point onwards should now be stacked on the boss's left leg. You will have points where both the adds are up and the focused Dreadflame is cast at the exact same time. We assign a single mark directly behind the boss for the focused Dreadflame target to run to and have our soakers stay around that area. Having the adds to the side of the boss prevents random players from being hit by the Dreadflame while they're trying to kill off the adds. Now on Heroic you'll also have a new reflection add that needs to be tanked. It has a large amount of health and only has one single ability. On a timer it will cast and deal damage to all players within its targeting circle around him, and each time it's cast the circle is larger and the damage is increased. Providing that all DPS swap to this add the moment it spawns, it will only cast a couple of times. We tank it permanently in melee just so we can cleave onto Kil'Jaeden while we kill it off. Now on the Bursting Dreadflame and Armageddon overlap, you again want Bursting players to move out of the raid, ideally away from meteor locations so other people can go and soak them. On Focused Dreadflame and Singularity overlaps, it is important you move your Dreadflame soak location if needed. The knockback always comes in a second or two afterwards, and if you're positioned badly, you'll simply just be knocked off the platform. On this overlap, we typically move the boss towards the location of the Singularity and hold our beam formation just in a new position. The last and worst overlap is the adds, Focused Dreadflame, and Armageddon, and this all happens simultaneously. It's not a bad idea during this time just to let the Dreadflame player die here and just battle res them afterwards. If you're lucky enough for it to land on an immunity player, they can just cheese it instead. Players of course during this time will need to soak the Armageddon, but get back quickly to destroy the adds as soon as possible. And that's it for this phase, you just need to react to the abilities as they're thrown at you, ideally being prepared far before they're even cast just by keeping an eye on your timers. Now the boss will transition at 40% health and enter his second intermission phase. It is possible for you to have a tank add up at this point, just make sure it dies fast as you really don't want him active during this phase.
Now as you transition you'll see multiple shadow adds appear within the platform and then you'll become engulfed in darkness. This effect makes you deal no damage and also prevents you from healing. Meanwhile the shadow adds start dealing damage to you. To remove this effect you've got to find Illidan, otherwise you'll just simply die. When you move within 8 yards of him, you'll gain a buff that removes the damage and healing prevention and replaces it with a dot. You're going to need to refresh this every 20 seconds or so. So finding Illidan is key, and this is easier said than done, but there are two indicators to help you. Number one is your hunters. Having track humanoids active as you enter the intermission will give you an immediate indicator where he is. Just spam click the minimap as soon as you find him and let the rest of your raid team know where he is. The second one, which is a little bit unreliable, is that a couple of frames as you're engulfed in darkness, you'll actually see Illidan's wings. This may be intended, but it's certainly not consistent. Some pulls it's there, some pulls it's not. If both of those indicators don't help you, you're instead forced to run around the platform and just find him manually. However, as a tip, he typically only seems to spawn around the edges of the platform, and coincidentally in most of our runs he was on the right hand side rather than the left. Now as the raid cannot be healed at this point and has an absorb shield stacking on them and is taking damage from the adds and potentially even Armageddon dots, this part where you're trying to find Illidan is pretty damn rough. We recommend that everyone saves at least one personal cooldown as you go into this phase and you use it immediately as soon as the darkness appears. And then the moment that we find Illidan, we use a spirit link and at least one large healing cooldown just to bring the raid back to a healthy level. And it's at this point the DPS can now run around the platform and begin to kill off the adds. Now these adds can be gripped and be stunned. You should really be doing both just to keep the damage on the raid low. And once you have killed off all the adds, phase 3 will begin.
Now the moment Kil'Jaeden appears, he'll start casting Darkness of 1,000 Souls. This deals a large amount of damage to the raid and also applies a permanent dot. We stack underneath him and use Darkness as well as any remaining personal cooldowns. Shortly afterwards, a rift will begin to spawn somewhere around the edges of the encounter area. It is important that you look out for this, as you'll be using this rift to deal with any other 1,000 soul casts, but also for the flaming orbs. On Heroic, Kil'Jaeden will mark a location under a random player that after a couple of seconds will spawn an orb. The orb will then begin to fixate on the nearest player. Once the orb reaches the target, or if it hits absolutely any player en route, it deals a large amount of damage but also creates a patch of fire. Now the size of this fire is based on how long the orb was kited for. The best way to deal with this orb is by having all players move from its spawn location, but also making sure they do not move towards the rift. By moving in the opposite direction, you create a clear path for the orb kiting player to move directly towards the rift, without any players potentially getting hit as it moves. The rift will quickly remove the fire once the patch has been created, if it spawns right next to it. The best players to kite the orb are definitely players with speed increases or high mobility such as mages. Just note that when it explodes, it hits hard. Make sure you either have a personal or an external from a healer, or just use an immunity. To help with this, you can just rotate players for each orb if needed. Now all players must use this rift when the boss casts his Darkness of 1,000 Souls cast again. Now as the boss is casting this, you should move towards the edge of the rift, and just as the cast is about to finish, everyone must jump over the line. This gives everyone the gravity squeeze effect. This just makes you immune to the cast, however it does still stacking damage, so do not move in too early. Once the cast is over, everyone must move immediately out and then the phase continues. Now also during this phase is the pseudo enrage, demonic obelisks. These spawn in random locations throughout the room, and after 10 seconds they'll explode, sending out beams in 4 directions parallel to the 4 sides of the room. Then they despawn. The beam will very nearly one-shot on Heroic, but getting hit even in normal mode is bad as it also knocks back, potentially knocking you off the platform completely. Now at first these obelisks are pretty easy to deal with. You have 10 seconds to see exactly where both of them are and just simply move into a clear area. However, as the fight goes on, more and more of them spawn. Towards the end of the fight, depending on how long you're in this phase, you may even see up to 7 or even 8 of them active at any given time. This obviously reduces the space you have significantly, and in some locations you just can't avoid getting hit when there's that many of them up. There is simply no special way of dealing with these obelisks. You just gotta look at where all of them are and find a safe spot. And do note that the beam that they send out is actually pretty wide, so you do want to exaggerate your movement into a safe spot. And that's all it is for this phase, apart from you still have the Fell Claws on the tank, and the Bursting Dreadflame, and the Focus Dreadflame, all overlapping with other abilities. However, there is no real solid set-in-stone strategy to deal with any of them. Because of the nature of the obelisks being random, you can't really set up positions in advance. You just gotta be flexible and smart with positioning as the phase progresses. And even though there is a pseudo enrage in this last phase, the damage requirement isn't actually high at all. You can stay in this phase for a very long time if you need to. You've just got to stay alive by watching timers, and once again, keep an eye on the obelisk locations.
So thank you very much for watching, guys. If this guide helped you out, drop down a like. If you'd like to know more about this encounter and further prepare yourself for when you finally pull him, then go check out our guide over on Wowhead. The link for that is in the description. And before we do go, we'd like to give a huge thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. All the support you guys have given us over the past few months has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you very, very much. And we shall see you all next week for the Mythic Guides.
Hell yeah. Thanks for watching.